Welcome back. If you do want to email us, what have you say at bbc.com. You can also text country code 447786 2060 80. Let me go back first of all to Nuhat, who is a Syrian living in London. And just before the news, Nuhat, you were telling me while we weren't broadcasting how frustrated you get at people who aren't interested in negotiation. But when people have seen some of the footage that's come out of Homs of young children being killed by mortars fired by the Syrian army, it's tough to think about negotiation, isn't it?
I agree with you that it's the footage which we see are horrible, but then you see also footages, you get one side of the story. I mean, there are footages which are horrible from both sides. That's why I'm saying by giving people more arms, we will end up with more horrible scenarios. And the only way to end this conflict is by, whether you have like 7,000 people killed or you have 70,000, you can't just carry on this scenario of violence. There has to be a genuine interest where people and the international community forces all parties to sit down and begin a political procedure where they agree on political reform which will be acceptable to all parties, not only one party.
Okay, Nahu, you make the case. Those of you watching, are you persuaded by the case that she makes? Nuhat is still with us. She'll be live for the next 30 minutes, so you can get your point straight to her. Shagun in Nigeria says, God, I pray that Assad goes and someone sensible takes his place. Only those who have not seen war or have not been on the wrong end of violence can advocate him staying. And Mustaf, watching in Somalia, says, I'm supporting Assad to stay and lead the country the right way. The opposition is simply trying to destroy Syria. Well, let's bring in a number of calls now because our phone lines are incredibly busy. Richard, you're in Berlin. Thanks for tuning in and thanks for calling. What's your point?
Oh, hello, right. Yes, I wanted to say that when the West tries to support an armed insurrection against an established government, effectively they're on the wrong side of legitimate law. Thank God for Russia for pointing out to us this point. President Assad is faced with armed insurrection, and obviously if this was in England, exactly the same reaction will be taking place now by the British Army. You simply just cannot allow armed insurgents to use weapons and fight government troops without doing anything against it.
Well, Richard, you say thank God for Russia. Let's bring in Sharif. He's a Syrian who works as a personal trainer in London. Sharif, are you glad that Russia is preventing further intervention?
I mean, it's disgusting that Russia has its stance vetoing any measures against Syria. I mean, the revolution only became militarized months into it, and that was because civilians who were protesting peacefully continued to be killed. And in any country where this would continue to happen, eventually people are going to pick up arms and say, we need to defend ourselves. That is the case, that's the fact. It was not militarized from the beginning. So I'm sorry, Bashar Assad caused this upon himself by continuing to kill people and forcing the opposition to arm themselves. It is absolutely absurd to say that Russia is correct in basically aiding and abetting this mass slaughter.
Richard, would you like to reply?
Yeah, well, I would like to say that, of course, whilst obviously everybody decries this sort of slaughter, nobody can really want this to happen. But let's face it, this insurrection is not taking place by accident. It's taking place because various Western governments have an interest in destabilizing the Assad regime.
Can we move on from these conspiracy theories? There's no evidence for this. I'm sorry. I mean, you bring the comparison with England. I mean, I'm sorry, we don't have a government here that would kill thousands of people before people started taking up arms. It simply wouldn't happen.
Sharif, Richard, let me jump in. Thank you for your call, Richard. If you're watching and want to take part, country code 44 2070 83 72 72. I've got a call coming in from Iraq. I'll put on air in a couple of minutes' time. But first of all, let's bring in Malou Innocent, foreign policy analyst at the Cato Institute. Good to have you on the program. I've read a blog post of yours entitled "Don't Arm the Rebels." For people who haven't seen it, tell us why.
Well, I think this actually gets back to the conversation that was had from the gentleman who is calling in from Berlin in terms of when is state violence permissible. And I think this really gets at the heart of the issue in terms of whether this is an insurrection or whether this is a legitimate struggle for a democratic Syria. My overarching fear, if we begin to arm, if I say we in terms of the United States, begin to arm Syria's rebels is that it might vindicate Bashar al-Assad's narrative that the insurrection is an appendage of outside forces. We've seen Assad say that these are al-Qaeda elements trying to dismiss the democratic forces as sort of appendages of Israel or the West or the Gulf states. And I think if we sort of see an increase in the amount of assistance going to the insurgents, whether that be small arms or logistical support, that will vindicate Assad's narrative, which actually might strengthen support for the Assad regime for those who are sort of still on the fence about whether to support his regime or not.
Sharif?
Look, I'm aware of the risks of increasing the militarization of this conflict. I'm fully aware of that. But if we do not arm the opposition, this is the situation we have. We have a situation where a very heavily armed government is fighting a very weakly armed opposition. And in this case, it has no incentive to negotiate. And we've seen, with all the efforts of the Arab League so far to get a negotiated settlement, the Assad regime has proven completely unwilling to do so. The Arab League removed ended its observer mission because Syria the government would not abide by the terms that it agreed to. And then the plan that it formulated, where Assad would give up power to his deputy and then have a national unity government followed by elections, the government scoffed at that. So we have no other option.
I completely understand where you're coming from. The issue is if we're going to intervene on the grounds of saving Syrian lives, then it should actually result in fewer Syrians being killed. Yes. We don't know if we begin to arm the Syrian resistance, if it'll crystallize the polarization that we've seen in Syria, if it'll actually weaken the Assad regime politically. We don't know that. I think really right now, Russia does hold the key to peace. And if the United States does want to sort of alleviate the violence and trying to abate the sort of internal polarization within Syria, the best way to go about that is through behind-the-scenes negotiations with Russia. Russia continues to arm the Assad regime. It continues to have billions of dollars of assistance to the Assad regime to carry out its slaughter. And really, I mean, the Assad regime is using tanks and heavy weapons that using small arms for the resistance is futile. Unless you're talking about going big or go home, you're going to need some sort of NATO no-fly zone or actual boots on the ground. But assisting the rebels with small arms is really just setting the resistance up for failure.
Look, until the Assad regime sees that the opposition is getting militarily stronger, it has no incentive to sit down and negotiate. It knows it's the stronger party. If we look at Yemen, for instance, the government was only willing to negotiate and end Saleh Hussein in power because the revolution was creating an increasing military threat against the government, and that's why it sat down and talked. At the moment, you have one party with all the power saying, well, I can do what I want. I mean, there's not going to be nothing to stop me. So not arming the rebels, I see the dangers, but then if we don't do that, we're just preserving the status quo, which is completely unacceptable. And
Sharif, I know as you're two talking, Nuha is gently shaking her head. Why are you shaking your head, Nuha?
I think, like, I agree with with what the lady said, that yeah, by arming everybody, you will only escalate the violence and give even more legitimacy for the regime to carry on what they are doing. And also, again, I mean, you don't want to end up with a situation where you arm people and then at the end, like, you risk more chaotic situation in the area, and you might also risk the retaliation and more like ethnic cleansing of certain communities. And to be honest, this is a main concern for so many Syrians. We don't want the situation to increase and escalate. We just want to see a form of all-round reconciliation in the region, where in Syria specifically, where all parties are forced to sit down. It shouldn't be Russia who should play the role of the international mediator. In fact, the Arab League...
I'm sorry, you have completely ignored the fact that the government has shown itself unwilling to negotiate. Basically, the Arab League gave up its efforts, its continuous efforts, because the government wouldn't negotiate.
Actually, in the last meeting in Tunisia, the Friends of Syria, the head of the Syrian National Council didn't call for any military intervention, and all Syrians, they said it's a Syrian issue which Syrians should only solve.
That meeting endorsed the Arab League plan, which the Assad regime rejected. I mean, what you're saying is very nice, very we'd all love to have negotiations, but one party is unwilling to do so. So where do we go from there?
The last call for negotiation was welcomed by certain parts of the opposition, for example, like what they call themselves Hayat al-Tansiq by Hassam Manna. They were willing to sit down and negotiate. A lot of the internal Syrian opposition were also willing to negotiate and sit on the table and try to encourage like a peaceful transmission of power. But
okay, so
the National Security Council and
Sharif, you're also trying to come in, but we've got a break coming up, and I can see Malou is very keen to make a point, and as we've not heard from her for a couple of minutes, do go ahead, Malou.
I was going to say that I think this all assumes that the Arab League has legitimacy within the Assad regime. I think for many within the Assad regime, it's not just Assad himself, but the sort of cadre of supporters that he has, whether military or civilian. The Arab League is sort of viewed again as sort of an appendage of the Gulf states. We sort of see the shifting balance of power. Syria was kicked out of the Arab League, or at least its membership was suspended, so to speak. But what legitimacy does the Arab League have? I think the only real force or foreign power that has leverage and influence within Syria and with the Assad regime would be Russia. We don't like Russia. I'm sure we have our own gripes with Russia. We don't like Assad. But if our goal is to end the further killing of Syrians, then we must look for even the most unpalatable option. And the most unpalatable option, even aside from NATO no-fly zones, it appears to be negotiation. People are unwilling to want to negotiate with Russia. And I'm sure it's going to be very difficult, but it's even more difficult to think that we should arm the resistance and then that will be the sort of panacea. I think negotiation is the way to go. It's going to be difficult, but that's the sort of direction we need to head
I'm going to come in here. Sharif, hold your thought because we've got to have a break. But Malou's using this word legitimacy. She says, is the Arab League legitimate in its involvement? Some people are saying, is the Syrian government got any legitimacy? Others questioning whether the opposition is a legitimate opposition. I'm curious to know from those of you watching, who do you think has a legitimate say in what's happening in Syria? Do get us on Twitter at BBC_WHYS. As you can see, those three are very keen to take on the conversation, but we've got to pause for a couple of minutes, then we'll be right back. Hi, I'm Ross Atkins. Thanks for joining me here on BBC World News. This is World Have Your Say. We're live as ever, and we're talking about Syria, the situation there. The latest is that that Red Cross convoy has reached Homs, but as far as we know, it's not in the Bab al-Amma district yet. And we're discussing a number of different issues, whether the rebels should be armed and whether President Assad should be allowed to go into exile if he wanted to. Well, let's cross straight to Maddie, who's with the World Have Your Say team, where all of your calls are being answered. Maddie, give us more of an idea of what's being said.
Well, we've been picking up calls from Algeria, Bangladesh and Tanzania in the past couple of minutes, though. We'll start with someone that's phoned in from California, though, Charles. He told us he wants military intervention in Syria. He says the United Nations needs to step in and help and to approve this. But Abhijit tweeted us, he says the world isn't black and white and that opposing evil isn't necessarily good. He says the international community should be wary before giving total support. Another point of view coming in via someone called Square Root on Twitter, though. This tweet says negotiation only works when parties involved are rational. He says Assad clearly is not. We've also got people getting in touch who were born in Syria but currently living elsewhere, like Lena from the Philippines. She sent us a Facebook message. She says people are dying. Assad should be executed for all the people that he and his army have killed. Thanks for everyone who's got in touch. 47 countries so far.
Thank you very much indeed. And one of those countries, Maddie, is Iraq. Let's bring in Shihab, who's phoned us up. Shihab, tell us what your point is.
Yeah, I think the UN move is too little, too late. What we need now is a massive and immediate aid for the Syrian people and a sort of intervention to stop.
Your line isn't so great, Shihab, which is a shame. But what I can hear you say is that the UN is taking too long to take action. It's a criticism we've heard quite often from BBC World News viewers. Thanks for making that point. Brian in the UK has tweeted us. Let's have a look at this by pulling it up on the screen. It's pragmatic for someone to offer Assad asylum. If there's even the slightest chance, it would help end the violence. Well, Sharif, Nuha and Malou, quick answers from you on this issue. Malou, should he be offered exile?
He can be, but what are you going to do with the Alawite Shias who have supported the regime? I think there's going to be a lot of violence directed at them. We've seen this from the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood saying that they are willing to exterminate the Shia Alawites that supported the Assad regime. I think the more fruitful discussion is what is Washington willing to trade to Moscow to get Moscow to encourage Damascus to relent on the violence and to create a unity
well, that's
government.
a whole other area which we're not going to get into in 90 seconds. Sharif, 30 seconds from you. Would you allow him to go to Tunisia if he wanted to?
I would prefer him to face justice in an international court, but failing that, if he was willing to accept asylum, then yes, I think that would be the right move. But I don't see him accepting that anytime soon. Ideally, justice. If not, if it's in the interest of saving much more Syrian lives, then asylum.
Nuha, what about you?
I think any offer should be feasible, whether Assad will agree or not. This is, I mean, I don't think the issue is whether Assad will agree to this, because I can't see him agreeing. And as Mali said, the issue is like, how would we promote negotiation and make sure that all sects of the Syrian society, all different ethnic groups in the Syrian society have their say.
All three of you, thank you very much indeed. Sharif and Nuha in London, Malou live with us from Washington, D.C. And of course, thanks to all of you in over 50 countries now who have called up World Have Your Say to talk about Syria. As ever, we never get you all onto the air, but in 3.5 hours' time, I'll be back with World Have Your Say Extra to try and speak to some more of you. And also remember, World Have Your Say is on the radio as well. bbcworldservice.com. Tune in 2 hours' time where we'll continue our conversations about Syria. I'll speak to you very soon. Goodbye.